They thought they were taking my home that morning, but what they didn't realize was they had already signed the papers that would take everything from them instead. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp and official, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when the sound echoed through the farmhouse walls, followed by the low idle of a diesel engine outside. Through the window, I saw it, a tow truck parked at the edge of my gravel driveway, its metal frame glinting under the early Texas sun, and behind it, a black SUV with tinted windows. The smell of fresh-cut hay drifted in through the cracked screen, mixing with the bitter edge of coffee in my mouth. But underneath it all was something colder, something that didn't belong here. I opened the door slowly, the wood creaking like it always had since my dad installed it back in '98, and there she was. Margaret Holloway. Perfect posture, tailored blazer, that same polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. She held a folder in one hand, thick, expensive paper, the kind designed to make everything inside feel final. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice smooth, rehearsed. "I'm afraid this property is being seized due to multiple violations and abandonment under HOA enforcement guidelines." I didn't say anything right away. I just looked past her, at the men already stepping out of the truck, at the way their boots crunched against the gravel like they owned the ground they were standing on. The air felt heavier, like a storm was about to break, even though the sky was clear for miles. "You've got 5 days to vacate," she continued, flipping the folder open just enough for me to see the official stamps, the signatures, the illusion of authority. "After that, this property will be transferred for redevelopment." Redevelopment. That word hung there, sour and artificial, like it didn't belong anywhere near this place. My grandfather built this farmhouse with his own hands. Every beam, every nail, every inch of land had a story that ran deeper than anything printed on her paperwork. I could still hear his boots on these floors, still smell the engine grease from my dad's workshop out back. And now she was standing there like it could all be reduced to a line item. I stepped out onto the porch, the wood warm under my feet, and took the folder from her without a word. The paper was smooth, almost slippery, like it didn't want to be held accountable for what it said. I skimmed the top line. Legal language. Threats dressed up as procedure. Nothing I hadn't seen before. Margaret watched me carefully, waiting for a reaction. People like her always did. They fed off it. "You should have stayed more involved with your property," she added softly, tilting her head just enough to make it feel personal. "This is what happens when people neglect their responsibilities." I let the silence stretch between us, long enough for the wind to pick up and rustle the trees behind the house, long enough for the men by the truck to shift their weight, unsure if they were supposed to start moving or not. Then I looked back at her, really looked this time, at the confidence in her eyes, the certainty that this was already over. And that's when I realized something. Margaret didn't just believe she was taking my farmhouse. She believed the system behind her made it inevitable. What she didn't know was that system answered to me. I grew up measuring time by the way light moved across these floors, not by calendars or deadlines. And standing there on that porch with Margaret, holding a piece of paper like it could erase decades, I could almost see every version of this place layered on top of each other. My grandfather bought this land in 1962 with money he made hauling lumber across 3 counties in a truck that barely held together, and he built the original structure one room at a time, working by hand under a sun that did not care how tired he was. The beams above my head still carry the marks of his tools, uneven and honest, nothing like the polished perfection you see in those subdivisions Margaret loves so much. My father expanded it in the late 1990s, adding the wraparound porch and the workshop out back, where the smell of oil and sawdust still lingers no matter how many years pass. That workshop paid for my college, paid for the first investments I ever made, and taught me that value is not something you declare, it is something you build and protect. I left for a while after that, moved into the kind of world where deals happen behind glass walls and numbers move faster than people can understand them, but I never let go of this place. Every contract I signed, every company I touched, it all traced back here in one way or another, to the discipline my father drilled into me and the patience my grandfather lived by. When my parents passed, the farmhouse did not just become mine on paper, it became my responsibility in a way that goes deeper than ownership, something you feel in your chest when you walk the property line and know exactly where every fence post sits even if you cannot see it. That is why I never sold when developers started circling 5 years ago, offering numbers that would have made most people pack up before the ink dried. They did not understand that this was never just real estate to me. It was leverage, foundation, and memory all at once. Margaret and her HOA board, though, they saw something else entirely. To them, this land was an opportunity sitting just outside their perfect grid of identical homes and carefully controlled lawns, a piece that did not fit their design. I remember the first letter they sent, printed on that same heavy paper she held in her hand this morning, talking about community integration and compliance standards like those words meant anything out here where the nearest neighbor is half a mile down the road. I ignored it at first, not because I did not understand what they were trying to do, but because I knew something they did not. Systems like theirs only look powerful from the outside. Once you understand where the money flows, once you know who carries the risk and who carries the debt, the whole structure starts to look a lot less permanent. Standing there with that folder in my hands, listening to the low hum of that tow truck engine and the distant sound of wind moving through the fields, I could feel that same calm settle in that I get before any major decision. Margaret thought this was the moment everything shifted in her favor. What she could not see was that every step she had taken to get here had already connected her to something much bigger, something she did not control. And I had been watching that connection for a long time. Margaret Holloway did not build her power overnight, and that was the first mistake most people made when they tried to understand her. They saw the polished exterior, the luxury SUV parked perfectly centered in every driveway, the tailored clothes, the way she carried a clipboard like it was a badge of authority, and they assumed it was all surface. It was not. Margaret had spent years constructing a system around herself, piece by piece, until the line between her personal ambition and the rules of the community blurred into something people stopped questioning. She moved into Willow Creek Estates about 8 years ago, back when it was just another quiet development on the edge of town, and within 12 months, she was already chairing committees nobody else wanted to deal with. Landscaping standards, parking enforcement, architectural approvals. The small things that most residents ignored until those small things started affecting their daily lives. I remember the first time I saw her in person, standing at the edge of a neighbor's property with a measuring tape in one hand and that same controlled smile on her face, explaining in a calm voice why their fence was half an inch outside of regulation. Half an inch. The neighbor nodded, embarrassed, like he had done something wrong, and that was the moment I understood how she operated. She did not need to raise her voice. She let the system speak for her. Over time, she became the system. The HOA board shifted around her, people coming and going, but Margaret remained, always positioned exactly where decisions were made and enforced. Her husband, Daniel Holloway, sat on the county zoning committee, which meant that when paperwork needed to move faster than usual, it did. Permits that should have taken months were approved in weeks. Complaints that should have been investigated disappeared quietly. It created a kind of invisible shield around her, one that made people think twice before pushing back. And then there was the developer, a mid-sized firm out of Dallas that started acquiring land just beyond the subdivision limits, slowly expanding the grid of identical homes outward, closer and closer to my property line. They worked hand in hand with the HOA, presenting everything as community growth, increased property values, a better future for everyone involved. But I had been in rooms like that before. I recognized the language, the timing, the coordination. It was not about community. It was about control and expansion, backed by financing that most people never bothered to look into. Margaret became the face of that expansion locally, the one who enforced compliance and identified obstacles. And I was an obstacle. My farmhouse did not fit their design, did not follow their guidelines, did not answer to their authority. At first, it was small things. Letters about property maintenance, suggestions about aligning with community standards, invitations to join the HOA that were framed as opportunities but carried an edge of expectation. When I ignored them, the tone changed. Notices became warnings. Warnings became violations. Each one carefully documented. Each one building a narrative that I was the problem, that my land was somehow out of place despite being here decades before any of their houses existed. Standing on that porch with her now, I could see the full picture clearly. Margaret was not just trying to take a farmhouse. She was executing a plan that had been in motion for years, backed by a system she believed was untouchable. and that belief was about to cost her everything. The first time they tried to force me out, it came in the form of a certified letter that smelled faintly of fresh ink and legal intent, the kind that arrives heavy in your hand and heavier in what it implies. I remember standing at the kitchen counter, the hum of the refrigerator steady behind me, as I unfolded the paper and read through a list of violations that felt almost surreal in their precision. Grass exceeding allowable height by 1 inch. Exterior structure not compliant with community design standards. Failure to submit architectural review forms for pre-existing buildings. Each line was crafted to sound objective, reasonable, like it belonged to a system that cared about order rather than control. I let it sit on the counter for a full day before responding, not because I did not know what it meant, but because I wanted to see what their next move would be. It did not take long. Within a week, a second notice arrived, this one more aggressive, referencing fines, deadlines, and the possibility of legal action if compliance was not achieved. The tone had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a conversation that had stopped pretending to be polite. I drove into town that afternoon, the tires of my truck kicking up dust along the long stretch of road that separates this place from everything they call convenient, and I sat down with a local attorney who had handled property disputes in the county for years. He skimmed the documents, nodded slowly, and told me what I already suspected. They were building a case, not one strong enough to stand on its own, but one designed to accumulate, to create the appearance of neglect and non-compliance over time. It was not about any single violation. It was about the pattern they were constructing. I filed a formal response, documented everything, and made it clear that the property predated their association and was not subject to their internal regulations. For a brief moment, it looked like that might be enough. The letter stopped for about 3 weeks, long enough for most people to think the issue had resolved itself. Then the real pressure began. One morning, I woke up to the sound of engines idling at the edge of my land, not loud, but persistent, like a presence that did not intend to leave. 2 pickup trucks sat just beyond the fence line, men standing beside them with survey equipment, bright markers already pushed into the ground like someone had started drawing new boundaries without asking. I walked out to meet them, the dry grass crunching under my boots, and asked what they thought they were doing. One of them handed me a work order with the HOA letterhead stamped across the top, referencing a planned infrastructure extension to improve community access. Improve community access. That was how they described cutting into land that had been in my family for over 60 years. I told them to leave, calmly, clearly, and they did after a brief exchange, but not before placing enough markers to make their intention obvious. That afternoon, another letter arrived, this one stating that failure to cooperate with community development initiatives could result in additional penalties and expedited enforcement. It was coordinated, deliberate, and escalating exactly the way systems like this always do when they believe they have leverage. Standing there at the edge of my field, looking at those bright markers against the natural lines my grandfather had set decades ago, I realized something had changed. This was no longer about paperwork or small violations. They were preparing to take physical control, to turn legal language into action. And the only question left was how far they were willing to go before they realized they had stepped into something they did not understand. The first time I tried to push back in a way that should have stopped everything, I did it by the book, exactly the way any reasonable person would. I gathered every document tied to this property, from the original deed my grandfather signed in 1962 to the county records that clearly marked the boundaries long before Willow Creek Estates even existed. I drove into the county office, the air inside thick with that familiar mix of paper, dust, and stale coffee, and requested a formal review of the HOA's claims. The clerk behind the counter recognized my name, gave me a look that was equal parts sympathy and caution, and processed the request without saying much more than necessary. That should have been enough. The law was clear. The property was outside their jurisdiction. But systems like Margaret's do not rely on what should be enough. They rely on pressure, timing, and the assumption that most people will give up before the process finishes. 2 weeks later, I received the response. It was written in the same polished language as every other document they had sent, but this time it came stamped with county acknowledgement. It did not deny my claim outright. Instead, it introduced ambiguity. It referenced overlapping development interests, pending zoning considerations, and the need for further evaluation. In other words, it bought them time. I called the attorney I had spoken with before, the same one who had nodded through the first set of documents like he had seen this pattern too many times to be surprised. He sighed when I read him the response, a quiet, tired sound that carried more meaning than any legal explanation. "They are slowing you down," he said. "And while you are waiting, they are moving forward." That became clear the very next morning. I stepped outside just after sunrise, the air cool and still, and noticed something that had not been there the night before. A temporary barrier had been placed along the edge of my driveway, not blocking it completely, but narrowing it enough to make a point. A sign hung from it, printed in bold letters, "Community Development Zone." The message was not subtle. They were redefining the space around me without permission, inch by inch, until resistance started to feel like inconvenience. I removed the barrier myself, set it aside carefully, and drove into town again, this time to file a formal complaint against the HOA for unauthorized interference with private property. The process was slower this time. More forms, more signatures, more waiting. Every step felt like walking through something thick and resistant, like the system itself had decided to push back. By the time I returned home that afternoon, another letter was waiting at my door. This one carried a different tone. It referenced my continued non-compliance and warned that further resistance could trigger expedited enforcement measures, including legal seizure proceedings. The words were clinical, detached, but the intention behind them was clear. They were not interested in resolving anything. They were interested in wearing me down. Standing there on the porch, the paper held loosely in my hand, I could feel the shift in the air again, the same one I had felt that morning Margaret showed up with her folder. My first response had followed the rules, trusted the system, and assumed that clarity would win. It did not. And that was when I understood something important. This was never going to be solved by playing along with the process they controlled. If I kept responding the way they expected, I would lose, not because I was wrong, but because they had designed the situation so that being right did not matter. The only way this was going to change was if I stopped reacting and started looking at the structure behind everything they were doing. And I already had a feeling where to start. The shift was subtle at first, the kind you only notice when you stop reacting and start paying attention to what is not being said. Over the next few days, the pressure did not come in loud or obvious ways. It came in small interruptions, carefully placed inconveniences designed to remind me that I was no longer operating on my own terms. The mail deliveries slowed down, sometimes arriving late, sometimes not at all. Packages I had ordered for the workshop sat marked as delayed without explanation. Even the internet connection, which had always been stable out here, began cutting out at random intervals, just long enough to disrupt, but not long enough to trigger any formal complaint. None of it was enough to prove anything on its own, but together it formed a pattern that felt intentional. That was when I stopped trying to push back through official channels and started observing the system the way I would analyze any investment or acquisition. I sat at the same kitchen table where I had read Margaret's letters, spread out every document I had collected, and began tracing connections. The HOA filings, the developer permits, the zoning adjustments, all of it pointed toward one central thread: financing. Projects like theirs do not move forward on confidence alone. They move on capital, on loans structured with timelines and conditions that most people never see. I pulled up records from the county database, cross-referencing names, entities, and transaction histories, and there it was, exactly where I expected it to be. A regional mortgage bank, not one of the big national names, but a smaller institution that specialized in funding mid-sized developments across this part of the state. The same name appeared again and again, tied to the developer, tied to the HOA's expansion plans, tied even to individual board members through personal loans and refinancing agreements. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under the shift in weight, and let the realization settle in slowly. Margaret did not control the system. She represented it. The real leverage sat somewhere else, somewhere quieter, buried under layers of paperwork and financial agreements that dictated how far this expansion could go and how fast it needed to happen. That explained the urgency, the escalation, the way they were pushing so hard to establish control over my land before certain deadlines passed. They were not just trying to take a farmhouse. They were trying to secure an asset that their financing structure depended on. I could almost see the timeline laid out in front of me, milestones tied to land acquisition, construction phases, projected returns. And if one piece failed, if one property did not fall into place the way it was supposed to, the entire structure could start to strain. The thought did not bring anger. It brought clarity. For the first time since Margaret showed up on my porch, I was no longer reacting to what they were doing. I was seeing why they were doing it. And more importantly, I was starting to see where they were vulnerable. I closed the laptop slowly, the screen going dark as the late afternoon light filtered through the windows, and for a moment the farmhouse felt exactly the way it always had. Quiet, grounded, untouched by the noise of everything happening beyond its walls. But that quiet was different now. It was not passive. It was deliberate. Because once you understand the structure behind a system like this, you stop trying to fight it from the outside. You start looking for the point where it can be turned from within. And I was very close to finding that point. The name of the bank stayed on my screen longer than it should have, like it was waiting for me to recognize it, not just as another entry in a long list of financial connections, but as something familiar. I leaned forward, narrowing my focus, pulling up older records, older transactions, going back further than most people ever bother to look. 5 years, then 7, then 10. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became, and with it, a memory I had not revisited in a long time. There was a deal, years ago, before Willow Creek Estates even started expanding, when that same regional mortgage bank had been on the edge of collapse. Bad loans, overextended positions, a portfolio that looked stable on paper but was rotting underneath. I had been brought in quietly, not as a public investor, not as a name that would appear in headlines, but as a solution. I remember sitting in a conference room with a handful of executives who were trying very hard to pretend they still had control, the air thick with tension and the faint scent of expensive cologne trying to mask panic. They needed capital, but more than that, they needed structure, someone to reorganize the risk, to keep the institution standing without drawing attention to how close it had come to falling apart. I gave them both. Through a series of layered agreements, holding companies, and trust structures designed to keep everything discreet, I stabilized their position. On the surface, it looked like a recovery driven by internal management and strategic partnerships. Underneath, it was something else entirely. I did not take a public seat on their board. I did not attach my name to their success. But I secured something far more important than visibility, control, not in the loud, obvious sense that people associate with ownership, but in the quiet, decisive way that only reveals itself when pressure is applied. Sitting there at my kitchen table now, with the late afternoon light fading and the hum of the house settling into its usual rhythm, I pulled up the current filings and confirmed what I already suspected. That bank, the one funding Margaret's expansion, the one backing the developer and the HOA's aggressive push into my land, was still operating under the same structure I had put in place. The same agreements, the same contingencies, which meant every loan they issued, every project they supported, every timeline they were racing to meet, all of it still ran through a framework I understood better than anyone involved in it. I let that realization sit for a moment, not rushing it, letting the full weight of it settle in. Margaret believed she had leverage because she had the support of a system. The developer believed they had momentum because their financing was secured. The HOA board believed their authority was expanding because everything around them kept moving forward. What none of them had considered was where that movement actually came from. I closed the laptop slowly, the screen going dark as the last of the daylight slipped behind the tree line, and stood there in the quiet of the farmhouse that they thought they were about to take. For the first time since this started, I was not thinking about how to defend what was mine. I was thinking about how to use what was already connected to them. Because the moment you realize that the system pushing against you is built on something you control, the entire situation changes. And Margaret Holloway, standing on my porch with her folder and her confidence, had no idea that every step she had taken to get here had already tied her future to a decision I had not made yet. Once the realization settled in, I did not rush to act, because moves like this are not about speed, they are about timing and precision, and the system Margaret believed she controlled was built on agreements that reacted to very specific triggers. I reopened my laptop, the screen casting a soft glow across the kitchen table, and began pulling the actual loan structures tied to the development. Not summaries, not public filings, but the deeper layers that outlined conditions, covenants, and thresholds that had to be maintained for everything to stay intact. The language was familiar, almost predictable in its complexity, designed to look impenetrable to anyone who did not already understand how these deals were constructed. But I had written parts of this structure myself years ago, and reading through it now felt less like discovery and more like revisiting something I had left unfinished. The developer's primary loan was tied to a phased expansion model, meaning they needed to secure and validate each section of land before moving forward to the next stage. My property was not just another parcel on their map. It was a connecting piece, a section that allowed their entire layout to function as a continuous development rather than fragmented lots. Without it, their projections shifted, their timelines stretched, and more importantly, their compliance with the loan agreement started to weaken. I traced the clauses carefully, running my finger along the lines as if they were physical boundaries instead of words on a screen. There it was, exactly where I expected it to be. A condition tied to land acquisition milestones, structured in a way that allowed the lender to reassess risk if certain properties were not secured within a defined period. Not immediately catastrophic, but enough to trigger internal reviews, enough to slow funding, enough to make investors start asking questions. I leaned back, letting the chair creak under me again, and considered how many people in Margaret's circle actually understood this. She saw the outcome, the expansion, the authority, but not the mechanics behind it. The developer likely understood parts of it, enough to know they needed my land, but not enough to see what would happen if they failed to get it. And the HOA board, they were operating on borrowed confidence, trusting that the system backing them was solid simply because it had not been challenged yet. I shifted my focus to the individual loans tied to Margaret and several board members, smaller in scale, but still connected to the same institution. Refinancing agreements, lines of credit, personal leverage that linked their financial stability to the same source funding the development. It was all interconnected in ways that would never be obvious from the outside, but once you saw it, you could not unsee it. The entire structure depended on continuity, on forward movement, on the assumption that nothing would interrupt the sequence they had planned. And yet, everything about their plan required my cooperation, whether they admitted it or not. I closed the file slowly, the quiet of the farmhouse settling around me again, and for a moment I just listened to the familiar sounds that had been here long before any of this started. The distant rustle of trees, the faint creak of wood adjusting to the cooling air, the kind of silence that carries history rather than tension. Then I stood up, knowing exactly what I needed to do next. I was not going to argue with Margaret or challenge her authority directly, because that was the game she understood. Instead, I was going to reach past her, into the part of the system she relied on but did not control, and remind it of the conditions it had been built on. Because once those conditions were brought back into focus, everything she had set in motion would begin to shift, not because I forced it, but because the structure itself would no longer support what she was trying to do. The next morning, I did not start with a phone call or a legal notice, because this was not the kind of move you announce. I started with a name. A contact buried 3 layers deep in a structure most people would never even know existed. Someone who had been part of that quiet restructuring years ago when the bank was trying to survive without letting anyone see the cracks. I still had the number. It had not changed. When the line connected, there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that comes from recognition without immediate confirmation, and then a voice that carried the same controlled tone I remembered. I did not introduce myself with explanations or reminders. I simply gave my name, and that was enough. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. "It has been a while," he said finally, measured, careful. "It has," I replied, looking out across the field where those bright survey markers still stood like misplaced claims. "I need a full internal review on a set of active development loans tied to Willow Creek expansion. Specifically the ones connected to Holloway Development Group and their associated HOA entities." There was another pause, shorter this time, but heavier. "That is a significant request," he said. "Those accounts are performing." I let a few seconds pass, not out of hesitation, but to make sure the next words landed exactly where they needed to. "For now," I said. "But there are conditions in those agreements that were not designed to tolerate uncertainty at the level they are currently approaching." The air inside the farmhouse felt still, the kind of stillness that sharpens every sound, every word. On the other end of the line, I could hear the shift, subtle but unmistakable, the moment when this stopped being a routine conversation and became something else. "Are you suggesting there is a risk we are not seeing?" he asked. I glanced back at the table where the documents were still spread out, every clause and condition mapped out in my head. "I am suggesting," I said evenly, "that a key acquisition tied to multiple phases of that development is not as secure as your current projections assume. And if that acquisition fails, it triggers a reassessment clause that affects more than just one project." That was enough. I did not need to say anything about ownership or control. The structure itself carried that authority. The agreements we had put in place years ago were designed to respond to information like this, not ignore it. "I will initiate a review," he said, his tone now fully aligned with the weight of the situation. "It will take some time." "Take what you need," I replied, "but do not wait too long." When the call ended, I set the phone down gently, the surface of the table cool beneath my hand, and stepped out onto the porch again. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the field, and for the first time since this started, those survey markers did not look like a threat. They looked like pressure points. Because once the bank began asking questions, everything Margaret and her developer partners had built their confidence on would start to shift. Funding timelines would tighten. Internal reviews would slow approvals. And most importantly, the assumption that my land was already theirs would be replaced with uncertainty. I leaned against the railing, the wood solid under my hands, and watched as a light breeze moved through the grass, subtle but constant. That was how systems changed, not with sudden force, but with pressure applied in exactly the right place. And Margaret Holloway, standing behind her carefully constructed authority, had no idea that the first crack had just been introduced into the foundation she depended on. The change did not announce itself with sirens or urgent messages. It came quietly, the way pressure always does when it starts to work beneath the surface. 2 days after that call, the first sign showed up in a place Margaret would never think to look. The developer's construction crew, the same ones who had been marking out boundaries and preparing for expansion, simply did not show up that morning. No engines, no trucks, no new markers cutting into the land. Just silence where there had been steady movement before. I stood on the porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the empty stretch of field, and let that absence speak for itself. Projects like this do not pause without reason. Every delay costs money, and money is the one thing systems like theirs are built to protect. By mid-afternoon, the second shift happened. I received an automated notice from the county database, something most people would ignore, a routine update tied to permit activity. Except this one was different. Several of the pending approvals connected to the Willow Creek expansion had been flagged for review. Not denied, not canceled, just paused, held in a state that required additional verification before moving forward. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking at, but I did. The bank had started asking questions. That evening, as the sun dropped low and cast long shadows across the farmhouse, my phone rang again. The same number. I answered without hesitation. "We initiated the internal review." The voice said, more direct now, less guarded. "There are inconsistencies between projected land acquisition timelines and current secured assets, specifically your property." I leaned against the porch railing, feeling the solid wood under my hands, grounding, familiar. "That was faster than I expected," I said. "It had to be," he replied. "If the acquisition does not close, it affects multiple phases of their development. That triggers a reassessment of their risk profile." There it was, exactly as I had mapped it out. Not speculation, not theory. Structure reacting to pressure the way it was designed to. "And what happens during that reassessment?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. There was a brief pause, not hesitation this time, but calculation. Funding slows. Additional conditions are applied. In some cases, disbursements are temporarily suspended until compliance is verified. I let those words settle, not rushing past them, because every part of that response translated directly into something Margaret could not control. Delays she could not explain. Decisions she could not override. Pressure she could not redirect. "Understood," I said calmly. "Keep me informed." When the call ended, I stayed there for a moment, listening to the quiet of the land, the same quiet that had always been here, unchanged by everything happening around it. But now that quiet carried something new. Momentum. Not loud, not visible, but moving in a direction that no longer favored the system pushing against me. The next morning confirmed it. Another letter arrived from the HOA, but this one felt different the moment I picked it up. The paper was the same, the formatting identical, but the tone had shifted. The language was less certain, more procedural, referencing ongoing reviews and temporary adjustments to enforcement timelines. It was a small change, the kind most people would miss, but to me it was unmistakable. Margaret was starting to feel it. She did not know where it was coming from yet, but the foundation she trusted was no longer as solid as she believed. I folded the letter slowly, setting it down on the same table where all of this had started, and allowed myself a brief moment of stillness. Because this was the point where everything begins to turn. Not when the opposition realizes they are wrong, but when they realize they are no longer in control. And Margaret Holloway was about to learn that the system she had relied on was not built to protect her. It was built to protect itself. Margaret did not wait long to show up again, but this time there was no slow knock, no carefully staged introduction like before. I heard the tires first, gravel shifting under weight, sharper than usual, followed by the sound of a car door closing just a little too hard. By the time I stepped out onto the porch, she was already halfway up the path, that same folder in her hand, but the confidence in her stride had changed. It was still there, but thinner. Now, stretched over something she was trying not to show. "We need to talk," she said, skipping the usual tone, the polished delivery she had relied on before. I leaned against the railing, taking my time, letting the moment settle the way it always does before something breaks open. "We have been talking," I replied evenly. Her jaw tightened slightly, just enough to notice if you were looking for it. "There have been some complications," she said, choosing the word carefully, like it might soften the reality behind it. "The development timeline is under review. That does not change the enforcement action on your property." I let out a slow breath, not out of frustration, but because I could see exactly where she was in the process now. She was holding on to authority that no longer had the same support behind it. "You are still trying to push this through," I said, more observation than question. "We are following procedure," she replied quickly, too quickly, the words landing with less weight than before. "The HOA has the right to enforce compliance." I nodded slightly, as if considering her position, even though I already knew how this was going to unfold. "And the developer?" I asked. "Are they still moving forward?" That was where it hit. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the smallest shift in her expression, the brief hesitation before she answered. "They are adjusting timelines," she said. Adjusting timelines. That was how systems like hers described pressure they could not control. I pushed off the railing and stepped down onto the porch, closing the distance just enough to make the conversation real without raising my voice. "And the bank," I added, watching her closely. That was the moment everything changed. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. She had heard from them. Maybe not everything, maybe not the full picture, but enough to know something was wrong. "That is not your concern," she said, and for the first time since I met her, the words sounded defensive instead of certain. I held her gaze, steady, calm, the same way I had in boardrooms years ago when people realized the numbers were not on their side anymore. "It is exactly my concern," I said quietly, "because everything you are trying to do out here depends on what happens inside that system." The air between us felt different now, tighter, like something had finally come into focus that could not be ignored. Behind her, the field stretched out the same as it always had, unchanged, unaffected by the shifting pressure that was now moving through her world. "You should reconsider your position," she said, but the edge in her voice was gone, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. "This can still be resolved without escalation." I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed everything I needed to know. She was no longer dictating terms. She was trying to contain something she did not understand. "It already is being resolved," I replied, letting the words settle between us. "Just not in the way you expected." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind moved lightly through the trees, the same steady rhythm that had been here long before any of this started. And standing there, looking at Margaret Holloway as the structure behind her continued to shift in ways she could not control, I realized this was the point where her system stopped being a weapon and started becoming a liability. She had built her authority on something she believed was solid. And now, piece by piece, that foundation was being pulled out from under her. The call came just before noon, right when the sun was sitting high enough to flatten the shadows across the field, the kind of still brightness that makes everything feel exposed. I was in the workshop when my phone vibrated against the wooden workbench, the sound sharp against the quiet hum of the space. I wiped my hands on a cloth and picked it up, already knowing who it was before I answered. "We have completed the initial reassessment," the voice said without preamble. No hesitation this time, no measured distance. Just facts. The development group has failed to secure a critical asset within the required timeline. That triggers a conditional review under their primary loan agreement. I leaned against the edge of the bench, feeling the familiar grain of the wood press against my palm, steady and grounded. "And the result?" I asked, even though I could already see it unfolding. "Funding for the next phase has been suspended pending compliance verification. Additional covenants are being enforced. They are under pressure to resolve the acquisition immediately or restructure their entire position." Outside, the wind moved through the trees in a slow, steady rhythm, unchanged by any of this. And for a moment, I just listened to it, letting the weight of those words settle. "Understood," I said quietly. "Keep the review active." When the call ended, I stepped out of the workshop and looked across the land that had been here long before any of their plans existed. The survey markers were still there, bright against the natural lines of the field, but they no longer felt like an advance. They felt like evidence of a move that had already failed. By late afternoon, the ripple reached Margaret. I saw her car again, but this time it did not come in with the same certainty. It slowed as it approached the driveway, paused slightly before turning in, like even the motion carried hesitation. She stepped out, the folder still in her hand, but she did not come up the path right away. For a moment, she just stood there, looking out over the property, taking in something she had not seen clearly before. When she finally walked up, her expression was different. Not defeated, not yet, but aware. "We received notice from the bank," she said, her voice controlled but tighter than before. "They are reviewing the development financing. It is causing delays." I nodded once, not surprised, not reacting. "That tends to happen when conditions are not met," I replied. She exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the open air, and for the first time, she did not try to correct me, did not try to reframe the situation in her favor. "This does not have to go further," she said, choosing each word carefully. "If you cooperate, if we can reach an agreement, the project can stabilize. We can resolve the enforcement actions. There are options." Options. The same system that had tried to force me out was now offering alternatives, not out of goodwill, but out of necessity. I looked at her for a long moment, seeing past the posture, past the authority she had built, to the pressure now shaping every decision she made. "You built all of this assuming I would fold," I said calmly. "That I would follow the same path everyone else did when you pushed hard enough." She did not respond, but she did not need to. The silence between us carried everything that had changed. "But this was never about compliance," I continued. "It was about control. And now that control is shifting." The wind picked up slightly, moving across the porch, through the open space between us, and for a moment everything felt perfectly balanced, like the point right before something settles into place. Margaret looked down at the folder in her hand, then back up at me, and whatever she saw there, whatever she finally understood, it was enough. The system she had relied on was no longer protecting her position. It was protecting itself, and in doing that, it had already decided which part of the structure it was willing to let go. Margaret did not come back the next day, or the day after that, and in a system like hers, absence speaks louder than any demand ever could. The letters stopped completely, not delayed, not softened, just gone, as if the mechanism that had been pushing them forward had quietly shut itself down. The survey markers remained for a while, standing there like reminders of an attempt that had already failed, until one morning I noticed they had been removed overnight, cleanly, without announcement, without explanation. No trucks, no noise, no confrontation, just an absence where pressure used to be. That is how systems correct themselves when they realize they have extended too far. They retract. A week later, I received the final confirmation, not from the HOA, not from Margaret, but from the same internal contact at the bank. The development group had entered a restructuring phase. Funding for expansion had been formally suspended. The project would not move forward unless its risk profile could be stabilized, and without my land, that stability did not exist. It was not framed as a failure. It never is. It was described in clean, neutral language about market conditions and strategic reassessment, the kind of explanation designed to keep everything looking controlled from the outside. But I understood what it meant. The structure had protected itself exactly the way it was designed to. And in doing that, it had removed the part of the system that could not meet its conditions. Margaret Holloway was no longer the center of anything. I saw her one last time about 2 weeks later, not on my property, not standing with authority, but driving past on the main road that runs along the edge of the land. Her car slowed slightly as she passed, just enough for a glance, just enough for acknowledgement without confrontation. She did not stop. She did not wave. She simply kept driving, and that told me everything I needed to know. The system she had relied on had moved on without her, the same way it had once moved in her favor when everything aligned. Standing on the porch that evening, the air cooling as the sun dropped behind the trees, I let the quiet settle back into its natural place. The farmhouse stood exactly as it always had, unchanged, grounded, carrying the weight of everything that came before and everything that tried to replace it. The wood under my feet creaked softly, the same familiar sound, steady and real, not shaped by contracts or approvals or borrowed authority. I looked out across the field, now clear again, the natural lines restored, no markers, no claims, no attempts to redraw something that had already been defined decades ago. And for a moment, I thought about how close all of this had come to going a different way, how easily someone else might have accepted the pressure, followed the process, and lost everything by trusting a system that was never built for them. But this was never about fighting louder or pushing harder. It was about understanding where the real leverage lived and waiting until the right moment to use it. Margaret believed power came from enforcement, from position, from the ability to apply pressure without resistance. What she never understood was that real power is quieter than that. It sits beneath the surface, patient, structured, and when it moves, it does not ask for permission. It simply changes the outcome. I took a slow breath, the scent of dry grass and wood settling in, and stepped back inside, closing the door behind me with the same solid sound it had always made. Because in the end, nothing here needed to be reclaimed or rebuilt. It had never truly been lost. The only thing that changed was who understood that.